It's a pleasure and it's an honor, I must say. I've been following you for a long time, and you taught me a lot from the Financial Times and from the books as well. And if I may, this book strikes me as a capstone in the curriculum. Something like a credo, a summary statement. And as I said to my editor at Project Syndicate, it it uh, it begins to feel like a masterpiece. So it's going to be hard to write the review because I had such a pleasure reading it. I really, it's almost shocking the theoretical angles you're able to muster here, and the chronological scope. So with that aside, let's see. The book strikes me, and I'm beginning with rhetorical questions, and I mean that questions about the rhetoric. It strikes me as an incredibly personal book, but you never use the first person outside of the preface. And it's very personal, even when you get to the macroeconomic part of it. There's a sense of urgency here that is kind of remarkable. So I wonder if you could talk about that for a little bit and say, tell us why why it feels so personal. I think it's not just me.
Well, I think it's personal for the reasons I put in the preface, that in the sense that I came into the view, it probably started with what's called the global financial crisis, but really a Western financial crisis. That things that I regarded as solid and sound turn out not to be. I mean, it's not the first time in history, God knows, that people have discovered that what they thought was solid and sound turn out not to be. Right. Keynes famously wrote about this in Economic Consequences of the Peace. Right. When he was looking back from the end of the First World War to the world that had disappeared, and as we now know, had disappeared for a generation or more. So the financial crisis was a big shock. I'd written a lot about it, but the scale of it and what was eventually the disappearance of the financial system for a few days, and the need to rescue it was a shock. And then a little bit long after that, so that was the sort of the capitalist system, as it were. We discovered, 1929 to 33 could perhaps happen again. We didn't, because we didn't follow the same policies, but we learned that. And then 2016 was obviously seminal. It was obviously clear there was a lot of authoritarianism going on in the world, but in 2016, we saw the emergence, to everybody's surprise, as far as I could see, certainly the people I talked to, of Donald Trump as the new leader of the Republican Party, a figure who would have been 10 or 20 years ago really unthinkable. And he was a joke. It's honest. That's what he was. And then the British decided to go for Brexit and to believe Boris Johnson. And then I could look around, and I started looking at democracy across all the world. And so I said to myself, neither our political nor our economic systems seem to be as solid as I thought they and hoped they were. And somehow this is interactive. It's not just that it's two separate things. They are interacting in complex ways. And it worries the hell out of me, because this is personal, because these are my countries. This is my civilization. This is the future of my children.
Yeah.
And there's similar things that happened before to my family. Now, I'd just like to comment on the style. It has always been my style, and it's a big effort ever since I started writing to do it, as it were, and with the academic approach. That is to say, the arguments count. The the evidence counts, the logic counts. Who I am doesn't count. Nobody should care about me. And I believe, rightly or wrongly, that it's more effective that way. In any case, I hate the emotional bullying of I. It's the way I was taught and the way I am. But I wanted to, put that in the context of what is personal, in the sense that this matters to us.
Yes.
In terms of values, in terms of history, and in terms of where we might be going.
Right. No, that's the hard part for me. I mean, I agree with you on all of that, and I agree with you on almost all of it. But let me get into the possibly the political part of this. I mean, it's clear from this book, but a lot of books that you've read and that are cognate works, shall we call them, that people like Fukuyama and what's his name, Barton and many others, it feels like the end times, or rather, it feels like that we're in the middle of this momentous transition that is comparable to the one that moved us from feudalism to capitalism. But this time around, we actually seem to know where we might be headed, where our choices might lead us. Now, I'm an old-fashioned socialist, which means that I'm a revisionist according to the Leninist specifications. I'm a follower of Edward Bernstein. So here I think that the politics does emerge. I'm with you as a socialist on suggesting that democracy is absolutely impossible in the absence of markets. But I would insist on the plural, and I think you do too. But I wanted to probe that a little bit. But as I understand your argument, you're not saying it's the market, but rather markets calibrated and regulated to produce social or public goods as well as private choices. And in that sense, I wonder if you could talk about your antipathy to socialism, because it doesn't sound to me like it sounds to me like you're an old-fashioned social democrat. So if you
to be fair, if you were going to critique me, I would say that that's roughly where I am now, and it's not where I was 30 years ago, but it probably is where I was 60 years ago. And so I followed a journey not so different from that of many others, but in the strange experience of becoming more radical as I get older. Yeah. Well, people think it's strange. Now, I haven't spent a lot of my life thinking about the connection between markets and democracy, because foolishly, I think now, I sort of took for granted that democracy was going to work. This was a well-entrenched system, I felt, in Britain and America. Of course, we knew there were problems, but democracy would work. And I felt, 30, 40 years ago, that the sort of, having come of age as an economist in the 70s, that we needed to correct some of the problems in, if you like, in the social democratic state that were then emerging. And for various reasons that would be very tedious to go into, a lot of those were in the direction of moving somewhat more to markets. Perhaps too far, but that's what I felt.
Right.
And so, to put it very in the bluntest possible form, when in 1976, I think it was, British inflation hit 26%, I thought, having worked on developing countries, if we don't get control of this, we're going to end up like Argentina, and that has to be stopped. Because the next stage after 26 is 100%. It doesn't go very. So I was one of those people who believed that we had to move towards markets. Now, this then comes back to your deep questions. What do I mean by market capitalism? I use capitalism, though I think it's a very unfortunate word, but because it's one we're familiar with, because ever since, the great man Marx. And but I mean competitive markets, obviously embedded in society, because there's clearly democratic politics implies law.
Right.
And of course, I always was aware that capitalism itself, or the market economy, had changed a lot over the last 250 years.
Right.
I don't go into this in detail, but obviously our market economy has essentially no resemblance to what Adam Smith thought a market economy was on every possible dimension. I'm going into that in detail. And our politics don't either. So it's a dynamic protean interactive system. But I do argue very strongly that we need competitive decentralized markets as part of our political economy. And I'm very antithetical to socialism, if by socialism you mean the full public ownership of all the means of production. Now, I don't really go into the 500, the many variants of democratic socialism, but as a young person, I would have been very much a democratic socialist, what we in Britain at that stage, a very long time ago, called a Gaitskellite, which was sort of a right-wing Labour Party person, but this is in the early 60s. Everything was more to the left. I've never been very keen on nationalisation. I'm quite open-minded over what things should be privately owned and what should be public owned. And it's perfectly clear to me that there has to be regulation, and we can debate what those regulations should look like. And I've changed my mind on a lot of that over time. So I'm quite pragmatic about this. Now, I consider the tradition you're mentioning, which is the great split in obviously the German Social Democrats, or in the 19th century. One of my friends and mentors at one stage was Tony Crossland, and he was essentially the same in the future of socialism.
Right.
You probably know this. For a long time, I haven't been a member of a political party ever since I was at the FT. But I've certainly moved left because centrally I've become more convinced than I would ever have been 30 years ago that if we don't do something about the way the market economy is working, we're going to lose democracy. And to tell you the truth, and then I realized, well, which do I care about more? Well, I care more about democracy. I hadn't realized that, but I do, which means I still want to keep a lot of market economy, but I really do. And this gets back to the sort of big thing about my history, both familial and personal, in the post-war period, was absolutely clear which side I was on. And there were a lot of left-wingers that I knew at that time in Britain, Marxists and others, were basically rather pro-Soviet. And I thought, not only was this a pretty bad economic system, pretty obviously it was an unspeakable political system. And that meant that in supporting the West, I inevitably was both a Democrat and a pro-Marx. It turns out all this is much more complicated. And in 1990, I'm repeating in my personal life a lot of the journey people went through from the late 19th century to the middle of the 20th century, including someone like Keynes, who started off as a pure laissez-faire economist and ended up as Keynes.
Yes, I was going to say you sound to me very much like the Keynes who arrived at that place where he was describing the ideal society as socialism in the pages of the New Republic, April 14th, 1932. Excoriating the Soviet Union, but saying, look, we've got all the materials and all the tools, all the procedures we need here to install that ideal society. So,
I wouldn't share that view because Keynes was more of an idealist. I don't believe in ideal societies. I believe in democratic societies struggling endlessly forever to solve their problems and find, which will no doubt cause new problems. I'm somewhere between Edmund Burke, the most intelligent of all conservatives,
Right.
and the Social Democrats. And as a political reformer, I'm very sympathetic to Burke. I believe in tradition.
Right.
I believe that one has to be aware of them. At the same time, nothing can remain the same because we live in a dynamic world, and life is complicated.
Right.
Banal, but obvious.
Well, I mean, again, yeah, I was almost surprised to see that Karl Popper was the presiding spirit of that question of reform versus revolution. But I got to say that that was a very convincing chapter. As I understand it, as I understand your argument here, this goes from front to back, is that the reason that we need markets is because they produce equality, they also produce the liberty, and therefore consent and agency, two sides, I think, of the same coin, become possible but not necessary. And so then the regulation and the calibration of markets is, of course, it just follows normally and naturally. So again, in that sense, I think I find the politics of this book absolutely remarkable, and if I may, refreshing as well. So that said, it's interesting to me that you also say, and this is in chapter 3, which I treat as the pivotal chapter. I speak as an historian, not as an economist. That the age of democratic capitalism is past.
You are right.
That you have these very, very specific boundaries on its chronological scope, 1870 to 1980, and yet there is a very realistic, I think, programmatic impulse here, or imperative here, that you believe that we do have the requisites to reconstitute a democratic form of capitalism, even under the conditions of globalization, which most of the left treats as the obvious impediment to the democratization of anything. So I wonder if you could speak to those two things, those chronological boundaries on the one hand, and why you think it's realistic to think that globalization has actually made the reconstitution of that of a system similar to it possible.
So, God, this is getting complicated. I think it's important to note that this book's audience, in some sense, subconsciously, is not the socialists who think that we have to close down the world economy.
Right.
And because there are a limited number of audiences one can address in one book like this, and inevitably I'm addressing it to people who think, as it were, that globalization either can dispense with democracy altogether, what I think of as the plutocratic tendency among the sort of people who read me. And I want to frighten them out of being complacent about that.
Right.
But I also want people to understand that it is possible in very large measure, though there's a political question about the limits of this, to have open international economies combined with what you describe as social democracy, broadly defined. Now, this then gets into some complicated questions. It actually goes, strangely enough, in my book on globalization, which was much more gung-ho than this one, which was published 22 years ago, I think, I pointed out that all the evidence we have is that and this actually aligns enough, one point I agree with him very strongly, that some of the most successful market economies, which are fantastically open, within colossally high trade ratios, deeply integration in the world economy, are also, and I argue that this is not an accident, extremely well developed and very expensive welfare states,
right,
and with very, very strong social support. support.
Right.
So the argument that you can't be globalized and have us doesn't fit with the experience of, let's say, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, or even modern Germany,
Right.
or Austria for that matter. So that was already there, and I remain absolutely convinced of this. The allowing globalization to, as it were, run havoc through your social compact is a social choice that the United States most obviously has made.
Mm-hmm.
See, having an open economy necessarily means abandoning the people, as it were, property capitalism. Doesn't follow empirically, and it doesn't follow logically. Give two aspects of this. Yes, it is clearly true that if you have an open economy, industries that are less competitive will disappear. That's quite normal. All small open economies understand this. But Americans are very bad at looking at the experience of other countries because they are very big and they think there aren't any others that matter. But actually, there are lots of countries that have done very, very well in equipping people to cope with these adjustments. Equip people and places to get new development, new businesses with better jobs.
Yes.
And rather than just abandoning people and places. That's a policy choice. And protection, which, and I've wrote about this today in my column, protection, which simply tries to prop up old, uncompetitive industries, which in my view, in the most cases, will never be competitive again, is fantastically costly for the economy, won't save jobs in industry in the long run. I have a long discussion of that. Deindustrialization is irresistible. And you're just locking people and the places into permanent decline with terrible social consequences. But that's a domestic policy choice. With a more active government, with more revenue, which could easily be raised. The United States is really a pretty closed economy. American corporations can't. I mean, the fact that American corporations don't pay tax is entirely voluntary on the part of the U.S. The U.S. could close all the tax havens used by its companies in one day. I mean, it's really not difficult. I mean, I discussed some of this. I mean, it's trivial. I mean, it's easier for America to insist that corporations pay tax properly than any other country in the world, because no corporation, none, can operate outside without being in the U.S. market. And so, the idea that, all these companies that are allowed to park their intellectual property in tax havens like the Cayman Islands or Bahamas, it's ridiculous. I mean, that could be stopped by an act of a pen. All you need is to say those aren't legitimate transactions. They're obviously not legitimate transactions. Nobody thinks the intellectual property or the profits of major American corporations are being obtained in those places. They're shelters. This is just allowing, and this is where plutocracy comes in. And the same applies to the tax, all sorts of immensely ridiculous tax loopholes in your political system, like carried interest. I'm against the tax deductibility of interest. Again, monopoly competition policy was abandoned, but it was a conscious choice to abandon it. It doesn't need to have been abandoned. Europe still has a competition policy. It's a political choice not to have a proper health system, but that's a political choice. You could save money and have a better one with a better life expectancy. After all, the U.S. has the lowest life expectancy of any major development. I could go on. These are all policy choices. Right. Now, the one area where so trade is not a problem. I think all the evidence is that there is probably a problem with capital flows. And I don't go into the
capital gluts or
capital flows. Capital flows.
Okay.
Yes. So there is an argument. I just don't go into this because a lot of that I discussed in my previous book, The Shifts and the Shocks. Right. That completely free capital flows I think there are two arguments here that are in the book. This one book is argument, this book and the other, that the completely free capital flows can create significant problems, even for countries big as the US. They're particularly through their impact on the real exchange rate and possibly in shifting decisively the bargaining power against workers. And so there is a capital flow question. I'm rather sympathetic to FDI because I think it's so beneficial to the countries that receive it. So I'm rather unhappy about the idea. I'm a globalist in this sense. I believe the welfare of other countries matters too. But there is a problem with capital flows, and there is certainly lots of evidence, which I do discuss in this book, if I remember correctly, that if a financial sector gets too big, and if the financial sector basically runs all the businesses in the economy, you get problems. Yeah. So but again, there is nothing preventing the US government from regulating its own financial markets. I mean, there is no external force. It's not true for others, but the US has all the means it needs if it wants to regulate its financial markets or corporate governance or anything else in a different way. Just needs the will. It has nothing to do with globalization. It has to do with the way political choices have been made in the US. And that links to the core point, a core point in the book, that over time, the US looks increasingly like a country that has become or has perhaps reverted to being what it was in the late 19th century, quite a dynamic economy, but a plutocracy. And that then is leading, I think, to an autocratic reaction. Which will win, I don't know. But to me, summarize the core argument, this is why normal democratic institutions seem to be robbed of legitimacy for people, ordinary people on both left and right, and we have this fraught state of democratic legitimacy. But none of that had to happen. It's a political failure. And it hasn't happened to that degree, extreme degree, in other Western countries.
Right. Well, let's, if I may, let's return to the politics of this, because in chapter 4, you make again a very convincing case that it's the economy, stupid, that is the necessary condition, and that these cultural factors that we all indulge and engage and discuss are, if not secondary, they are at least conditioned, saturated, determined by the economic. But let me ask you again what might seem a political question, but I'm not sure it really is, especially after hearing about your own personal odyssey. But in chapter 8, the New Deal chapter, which I think is predicated on everything previous, particularly for me anyway, chapter 3. Now, in the FT, you noted, I think, very significantly, the growing difference between business revenue and business investment. And that, it seems to me, at least as I read it, that's key to what Ben Bernanke calls the global savings glut. You also talk in chapter 8 again about how public investment is the enabling factor in private investment, and then you also cite both Robert Gordon and Larry Summers about the secular stagnation in the context of trying to say, well, what are the outlets, what are the opportunities for private investment now, and at the same time, in this chapter and others, you express very explicit doubts about indicative planning. But, in addition to the things you just talked about, how the United States could very easily solve this problem of offshore parking of profits and taxation, isn't indicative planning the obvious solution to, say workers in Ohio are displaced, instead of establishing tariffs to protect them against industries, say in China, wouldn't the kind of planning that we see embedded in the Inflation Reduction Act be a better solution than not just tariffs, but of any other solution I can think of. So
yeah. So the answer is we're now engaged in some very interesting experiments, and so let me separate out what I think are two or three different aspects of this. First of all, there's a straightforward aggregate demand problem.
Okay.
And it's pretty clear if you put my last two books together that I think, coming back to the savings glut and all the rest of it, that if we had invested more in a productive way, both at home and abroad, we could have avoided some of our problems. Because, I can refer to work by Raghuram Rajan, a good Chicago school guy, who basically points out, well, given that we didn't do sensible things about investment, public and private, we basically create aggregate demand through consumer credit, and directly and indirectly, and that didn't go well, and it won't go well. What you want is investment, which will drive higher wages, and so there's no doubt there needs to be investment, and and there are some areas where it's pretty obvious we would want to do investment, and I think I discussed those, but if I don't, I should. And the most obvious is anything climate related, and which means actually a massive investment push across the world might be decisive, because basically it's reconfiguring our energy system, which is a very, very big thing. So that's a good case. The problem at the moment is we don't have the policies and incentives in place to do this well. In that context, as I say in my column today, actually, while I regard the subsidies of the IRA as a second best, they might well be better than anything else that's going. So I have no problem with the attempt to push on that through, well, I have some, because it's going to create a subsidy war, but maybe this is a beneficial subsidy war. Everybody's going to subsidize investment. Yeah. Now, is that indicative planning? Well, it is in a certain sense. You decide that you want, it's not planning the whole economy. Right. It's not even trying to decide what are the valuable, all the other investments. What it's more like, I suppose, one of the great investment programs of America, which perhaps now we would think wasn't so good, but it was good for a half a century, with the Great Highway Program of the 50s. And you could say that funding a green transformation, which I think should really be about renewables and the renewable systems, is a big push investment program, and it might have very high returns. And the state, in the absence of carbon pricing and all the rest of it, is going to need to push it. So that's okay. I have no problem with that. I don't regard it as full indicative planning. And there may well be other, I'm very strongly in favor of government support for research and development across a wide range of, things like health, life sciences, and so forth. There are clearly very big opportunities for doing even more than we've done, and government investment is crucial in those sorts of things. It's a classic public goods research and development. So I think of this as more peaceful social engineering than an indicative planning. Maybe it's just the word planning that I'm neuralgic to. But if you look at the French indicative planning thing, one of the reasons I'm a bit neuralgic about it is that back in the 60s, we tried to do it in Britain, and it was a colossal flop. It's very difficult to do well. But the key thing is, you think of areas where government can intervene and act to build out infrastructure, capital stock, skills, innovations, which the market won't do, and which can be at big enough scale to have effects both on aggregate demand in the short run and growth in the long run. If you can identify those things, and I talk about some of the aspects of that, then I think it's absolutely fine, as long as you realize There are so many things about how the economy is going to unfold now, and I think that comes out, which we really don't know. I think the economy is difficult for us now. We're obviously going through one of these huge technological upheavals um, in both life sciences and in information and technology and artificial intelligence, and in finally in renewable, in the energy transition. These are things when you're in the frontier economies, and the US is a frontier economy, perhaps the frontier economy.
Sure.
Planning that stuff is hard because you're going to find there are so many things you don't understand. It's completely different for China. I mean, the point is, China basically knew what development was going to look like because so many countries had already done it. The US doesn't know what it's going to look like over the last 20 or 30 years. This is where the market as a search mechanism is so valuable. But I agree completely. There are things that can be done. Spending money by government is part of that. Big investments are part of that. I expect a lot of it will be wasteful, but some of it may be absolutely fundamental, and I certainly wouldn't oppose it. But I would just stress there's going to be a lot of trial and error in this process, more trial and error than there's going to be, my goal, we got this plan, it's all going to work, because that's not, I think, how it's going to be.
Right. I agree with that too. I'm almost embarrassed in all this agreement between you and me. It's anyway.
Just think how embarrassed I am.
What, you mean just because I'm an old-fashioned socialist?
Yes, exactly. God, I mean, everybody's view that Wolf has gone completely to the dark side.
Well, that's going to be part of the review, believe me.
Well, that's the end of me. That's the end of me. No, my readers have already decided. Actually, a lot of people, though by no means all, as you can see if you read the Wall Street Journal review, have come to realize there is a problem. And there are lots of business people and even billionaires who actually think, we'd rather have a democracy than this.
Yes.
And then they find what's going on in politics now really scary because they don't know where it will end. And that's the starting point.
Yes. I mean, that's the great promise of this moment. I think, that moment when ruling classes decide that they don't really know how to do it anymore and they have to cast about for good ideas. I hope, for their sake and ours, that they read your book.
Well, I hope that they don't have the same defensive and ridiculous. Well, I mean, obviously, I didn't expect the journal to be any different, but I hope that there are more intelligent people out there who say, we're moving into an autocratic moment. We know that's not going to fix anything. Right. We have to play a big part in preventing that. And I wanted to encourage them with this book, my readers, basically, to be proactive.
Well, in that sense, your book reminds me of two books that were published in 1944. One was Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformation, which you cite, and the other is Lawrence R. Klein's book, The Keynesian Revolution, in which he was very explicit, saying, if you want to head off fascism, this is the way to think, this is the way to go. So, and that's how I read, your new book as well.
I wouldn't compare my book with these classics, but I would certainly say I would like to play a little part, tiny part in making people realize this is a dangerous moment, but there are ways out.
Well, shoot, I got more questions, but that seems like a fitting place to conclude.
You can certainly ask me more questions if you want more, but I better stop in 15 minutes. It's entirely up to you.
Okay. Well, here, let me then just, and we can cut this at the end or not, but, I'm fascinated by again, the sense of an ending that many, many books out there, convey. And, one of them that I reviewed for, Public Books, this is a couple of years ago, was, by your friend Mervyn King,
Yep.
the former governor of the Bank of England, The End of Alchemy. I'm sure you know that book. What shocked me about it was his citation and the intellectual, not reliance, but just the effect on his thinking of William Kellogg, of all people, the 19th century monetary theorist, some would call monetary crank. But as I read the book, what Mervyn King was calling for was an effective end to banking, because he was talking about equivalence. Right? You have to have this much valid cash or its equivalent if you're going to loan that much out. And it struck me then, when I read the book and reviewed it, that he was in the same camp as Willem Buter, the former. Also, he was associated with the Bank of England, and then he went to Citicorp.
Yeah, Buter.
Yeah, thank you for that. The idea that there's no stable or solid rationale anymore for private control of banking, and most of the books that I've read about banking recently, at least that is the implication, if not the explicit argument of the book. So, what do you make of that? I mean, in view of our I think shared views of what socialism can do and what it cannot and should not do.
Well, you're right that many intelligent economists, and this actually goes back to the 30s with the Chicago School, and actually, interestingly, the Austrians, of all people, that banking is a very special problem. And I wrote about this at great length in The Shifts and the Shocks, but I didn't return to it in that now. And economists have approached this in many different ways, but the core problem is that these institutions, which are absolutely central to the modern economy and have been, well, you could argue for half a millennium, but increasingly in the last 200 years, as concentrations of liquid finance and as guarantors of the principal providers of safe assets for the entire society, are running a con game. That's simply all. We know that. There's nothing mysterious about it. It's perfectly clear. They make a promise to people that their money, what they regard as their money, is perfectly safe and perfectly liquid, and they can have it whenever they want. And on the asset side, they hold nothing but illiquid assets.
Right.
And that is not possible. But that guarantees that in any situation where there is any doubt about their ability to provide money to the public, they are going to have runs that they cannot deal with. And so the way we've dealt with this is to create a public insurance mechanism, which is the central bank. And because the central bank takes the liquidity risk, you can be confident that these liabilities will at least be liquid. But then you get the second problem, which is what I've been concerned about, Mervyn's. That's all very well, but what happens if in a crash, actually you start looking at their assets and it turns out actually they have a negative net worth? Then just providing the liquidity doesn't work. They're bankrupt. And if you've got institutions where equity capital is 5, 6, 7% of assets, or becoming bankrupt is incredibly simple and very easy to. And so what Mervyn is saying, in essence, is we have to find a way of ensuring that a bank doesn't operate when bankrupt, and in any situation, and we have to do that by pre-positioning it, by basically saying they must have enough assets which we have value with a haircut, which we can lend against freely and we know are valid, which are because we looked at them, pre-positioned them, sufficient to cover their liquid liabilities, their deposits. Now, once you insist on that, you change the whole composition of the balance sheet of the banks.
Right.
They just can't run. They can't. There are a whole slew of assets, non-marketable, unvaluable assets, which you can't use against their liquid liabilities. That will be a tremendous transformation of banking if that were introduced. The way we've actually done it is, in principle, the governments have guaranteed the solvency of banks,
right.
and that's why they put all the capital into them when they went bust. Right. So these institutions are guaranteed against liquidity risk and solvency risk by the state. This is not the private sector. These are parts of the state. Major banking institutions are parts of the state. And so I've had the joke, which I've used many times, that bankers are simply the most highly paid civil servants in our society. Now, the question is, what that guarantees crises. It absolutely guarantees crisis. Now, what do you do about this? Mervyn's is a relatively modest proposal. There are two other proposals. One, two friends of mine, Marty and Martin Helvig, is to force them to move their equity ratios from 5 or 6% true equity, I'm not talking about risk-weighted stuff, right. To 30% or so. So they run the way investment banks used to run when they were partnerships. They had huge equity, absolutely gigantic equity, and that meant they were solvent. It makes it easier for central banks to lend to them. And the other one, the most radical of all, which I really like, is the Chicago Plan, which basically means that you can only make promises of liquid liabilities if you hold corresponding liquid assets, which means, in essence, government bonds or equivalent.
There you go.
And that basically abolishes banks, part of the private sector. They become part of the public sector.
Right.
And the bank liabilities money funds the government. I discussed it in Ships and the Shocks. And then private intermediation is done through maturity matched institutions, like BlackRock and all these. Basically they become asset management companies. Now, no government has been prepared to take these revolutionary steps, and perhaps they never will, because one, there are tremendous convenience in the present arrangement. Some people would argue some real economic value in the present arrangements. But we've always known that at the core, now we've known for at least 70, 80 years, but sometimes much longer, that at the core of the financial system, there are institutions which only exist because of the state. Before the American state got involved in this way, before the Federal Reserve was created, in particular, 1913, I think, you will correct me.
Definitely.
The Americans did have banks, but they went under regularly, and there were one banking panic after the other. The economy worked, but it worked with stupendous disruption.
Yes.
And it's perfectly clear to anyone with the meanest intelligence, though some people on the right deny this, that if you started running banks like that again, there'll be a revolution, and no government could allow that to happen. So banking is the dark secret at the heart of our economy. It's a socialized system underpinned by the state for the convenience of everybody. And I'm very happy with one of the revolutionary alternatives, and I've discussed three of them. And I think I don't discuss that in this book because it's very technical. Most readers don't understand what banks do, and I wanted a wider audience. And I disclaimed in my previous book, but it's not what I intended to discuss. But this is really important because it means that the core institutions in the financial sector, and they remain the core institutions, are quite demonstrably part of a state system.
Well, I couldn't have put it better myself. No way I could have. Anyway, thank you for that. Would you like to make some concluding remarks here, and before we go?
Well, I'm very pleased that you understand the book and the importance of the book. I want to stress that I do discuss this. I focus on economics to a significant degree, and I do have this view that there is a long-standing, and hardly original point, but there's a long-standing sort of way for the wealthy to manage a democracy in their favor, which is to split people in the middle and bottom from one another on cultural, racial lines. And I refer to that as the Southern system. And for me, it's the purest example in Western history of such a system. And it seems to continue to work remarkably successfully. And it does clearly engender spectacularly loyalty to the leadership of many in the middle and lower middle classes on cultural and racial lines, to the point that they fought and died in the Civil War on a staggering scale. I think we are seeing some of that, a lot of that return on the right. That is to say, the right is operating within a democracy by splitting the rest of the population on cultural lines. And I think the modern left has made a tremendous mistake strategically in exacerbating that by because of the numbers involved, numbers of the modern left as academics, predominantly university educated intelligentsia, people like us, by making it very clear that they utterly despise the morals and culture of what we call the deplorables.
Right.
And this is politically very unproductive because it reinforces this very undesirable symbiosis between the more predatory part of the plutocratic system and ordinary people. Yeah. Once you're in a mode in which politics is no longer about sensible policy, which is for the welfare and benefit of almost everybody, the majority of the population, but it becomes a cultural war overlaying class war, there's no other way of thinking about it, you are in a sort of civil war type situation. And this is why I'm not making any other parallel. Please God, I'm not making any other parallel. But this is why I insist on it, why the conservatives, the business people, the army and so forth in Germany chose Hitler. Yes. Because from their point of view, he was their sort of guy as opposed to the Bolsheviks, who they hated even more. Right. Now, we are, of course, not there. Nothing like it. Nothing. But I think we played into the hands. And I think, university-educated people have played a part of this by insisting that all the cultural norms, perfectly normal cultural norms 50, 60 years ago, are absolutely reprehensible. And they've exacerbated divisions in our society, which are undermining democracy. So that's how I see culture, which is, of course, very Marxist perspective, and I accept that. And so there we are. But the underlying point I want to make is that we can resolve this sort of problem and have resolved it before if we make as far as we can culture of individual choice and individual rights. A lot of them can be dealt with, I think, in those ways. And rights of individuals, of course, include groups of similar individuals. And at the same time, focus politics, and this is what I think the center has to do, particularly the center left and center right, on trying to deal as best we can with the huge challenges, real challenges we face, bringing our societies together, of managing the world in a way that we don't blow ourselves up, and managing the world in such a way we don't destroy the environment, preserving peace, preserving the planet, preserving a basic prosperity. These are immeasurable challenges, and the culture wars, to me, are a spectacular and horrifying diversion, which we should be able to get away from if they weren't so politically convenient for so many.
Yes.
So that is perhaps my most provocative statement, and it is not something I say in that way in the book, but it does worry me that we're fighting about things that are, I understand that these things matter a lot to some people, but there are even bigger issues at stake in this next century.
Yes.
They are existential.
Again, I couldn't agree more, nor put it better. So, with that, I guess we can conclude. Let me just say,
I think that's been a pretty good discussion,
yes,
and I look forward to whatever you write. I mean, I presume you've got a normal project syndicate length, or
Yeah.
how many
they
how many words will they give you?
3,500 to 4,000. So,
Oh, well, that's
yeah,
monstrous.
yes, I know. I'm
That's
gonna
almost as long as twice as long as my piece for the MP. I'm looking forward to this. I didn't realize anybody was allowed to write something that long.
Well, I pitched it that way. I said, let's go long here. But I'm going to use Fukuyama's liberalism and its discontents, and Barthan's A World of Insecurity as foils. Because they're the political theorists. Your theoretical angles are much broader. So I'll just use them as
Well, my theoretical angle is very different. I've been very influenced by Frank, but I haven't actually read that book because I was then at the completion stage of my book, and I decided I had to stop reading more. So I'm now going to read these books. I mean, there's a moment in a book when you say, I've done the best I can. I already spent 5 years on it. As you can guess, this was a very long, hard journey. And while I think it's a massively imperfect book, I think it's in some sense, the worst book I've written because it's so big. But I also have no doubt, to my mind, it's the most important and the one that matters most.
All right. I can agree with the latter. And I'll disagree with the former.
That's your privilege.
That's right.
I love people. I do feel that some of the people who read it and reviewed it really didn't understand it, and some of it and what was original in it. And I think others, of course, just mauvais foi.
Well, I'll just leave it at this. I was asked to give this person who's putting together these lists the 10 best books on the development of capitalism, and most of the usual suspects were in there, but now I have to displace someone and add you, and it's going to be hard. But I'm definitely going to do this as the displacement.
That's going to be very painful. Anyway, I love talking to you. Please keep in touch.
Okay.
Where do you live, by the way?
I live in New York City, but right now I'm in Mexico, sort of on vacation. So.
Okay, well, maybe you can meet some.